Edward, who has neurofibromatosis, lives in New York and dreams of becoming an actor. So far, his only role is a small part in an educational video about stopping bullying and cruelty toward people with unique appearances. However, the director criticized his performance, leaving Edward feeling down as he heads home. On the subway, he notices people around him and feels like everyone is staring at his face. Some passengers are clearly looking at him, and one person starts acting rudely, bothering others. Then, a man approached Edward and gives him a business card, saying he is looking for people with unusual looks for a film. When Edward gets home, he notices a beautiful young woman moving into the apartment next door. Inside his own apartment, he spots a leak in the ceiling and puts a bowl under the dripping water before starting his chores. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door. Startled, Edward accidentally cuts his finger with a knife. When he opens the door, it's his new neighbor. Seeing the blood, she quickly grabs a first aid kit to treat his wound. The woman, Ingrid, is confident and outspoken, which makes Edward feel awkward. He barely manages to grunt in response to her many questions. As Ingrid looks around Edward's apartment, she notices a photograph of a young woman with a little boy. Edward admits the woman is his mother, leading Ingrid to realize his disfigurement wasn't something he was born with. Curious, she asks about his profession but soon spots a typewriter and assumes he's a writer. Edward quickly denies it, explaining he just found the typewriter on the street. Despite his denial, Ingrid reads a few lines he had typed and finds them both profound and tragic. She then reveals she's an aspiring playwright and, upon learning Edward is an actor, suggests they could become famous together. Incidentally, she confesses she initially came over just to borrow some laundry detergent. The following day, Edward visits his doctor, who warns him that the tumor growth might soon impact his vision. The doctor offers him a chance to join trials for a new experimental drug that could potentially cure his condition. Though the treatment isn't proven, it might change Edward's life. When Edward returns home, he notices his front door has been freshly painted. Seeing a trail of paint leading to Ingrid's apartment, he quickly realizes she is responsible. Inside Edward's apartment, things get worse. The hole in his ceiling has grown larger. He places a bucket under the leak and decides to take the typewriter to Ingrid as a housewarming gift. She thanks him, but their conversation is cut short when her boyfriend arrives, prompting Edward to leave awkwardly. The following day, Edward auditions for a role, performing a monologue from Scio. Despite pouring his heart into the performance, the producers remain unimpressed, leaving him dejected. That evening, Edward shows Ingrid the social ad he was in. The short clip highlights how people with unique appearances are a valuable part of society and the workplace, encouraging viewers to look past initial impressions. Ingrid isn't particularly moved by the video but, unexpectedly, suggests treating the skin on Edward's nose, but since no one besides doctors has ever touched his face, Edward feels so uncomfortable with Ingrid's suggestion that she quickly drops the idea. Edward decides to go ahead with the experimental treatment. At the clinic, he lies on a special table as machines scan his face to analyze the tumors. A new drug is injected under his skin to track its effects, and a mold of his face is made for comparison as treatment progresses. The doctor notices Edward's bandaged finger and carefully redresses the wound before sending him home with a journal to document any changes in his condition. On his way home, Edward observes happy couples strolling along the streets. He unexpectedly notices a new statue of Abraham Lincoln and stops to stare at it for a long time. As he finally walks away, the statue seems to come to life, silently watching him. In the evening, Edward finds a gift bag outside his door containing laundry detergent, face cream, and candies, along with a note from Ingrid thanking him for his kindness. Touched by the gesture, Edward settles on his couch, opens the candies, and starts eating. Suddenly, he begins coughing but quickly recovers. Noticing his bandage is wet, he removes it and is shocked to see that his finger has fully healed. Just then, a piece of his ceiling collapses, and a dead rat falls into the bucket he placed under the leak. Later that night, Edward is startled awake by loud knocking and shouting. Rescuers have arrived to retrieve one of his neighbors, who has tragically passed away. Feeling moved, Edward decides to adopt the deceased man's cat. He watches from his window as the young man's body is carried away. The next day, Edward and Ingrid have dinner at a cafe. Ingrid bombards him with questions and earnestly pleads with him never to talk about harming himself. Their conversation then shifts to plays Edward enjoys. Suddenly, someone outside taps on the window and waves at Edward, surprising Ingrid, who hadn't expected anyone to recognize him. Before they part, Ingrid declares that Edward will star in the play she's writing. That night, heavy rain worsens the leak in Edward's ceiling. As he inspects it, a chunk of plaster falls, hitting his face and injuring him. When he wipes away the blood, he inadvertently peels off a piece of skin from his forehead and cheek. The following morning, Edward visits the doctor, who is astonished by the rapid improvement in his condition. Edward, however, feels uneasy about the changes. The doctor explains that the treatment works by shedding disease cells, which are replaced by healthy ones. He provides Edward with a mask-like device to help monitor the transformation process. Later, Edward feels unwell but experiences an unexpected moment of recognition when someone from the social ad acknowledges him. Stopping by a cafe, the bartender greets him warmly, and another customer recognizes him as well. That night, overwhelmed by emotions, Edward breaks down in tears. In a sudden moment of impulse, he pulls at his skin, revealing a handsome face beneath the damaged surface. For the first time, he gazes at his reflection, stunned and overwhelmed by the transformation. To his amazement, he even learns to whistle, a skill that had been impossible due to his previous lip deformity. Soon after, Edward visits a bar, where he drinks with strangers, meets a woman, and ends the night in the restroom, symbolizing a new chapter in his life. The next morning, Edward's doctor pays him a visit, concerned about his absence from follow-up appointments. Edward lies, claiming the previous tenant of the apartment passed away, and adopts a new identity, introducing himself as Guy Moratz before quickly ushering the doctor out. Unbeknownst to him, Ingrid overhears their conversation. Edward moves into a more luxurious apartment and begins dating various women. Over time, he becomes a wealthy and successful real estate agent. Despite his newfound success, deep down, Edward remains the same insecure man he always was. One day, Edward spots Ingrid on the street and follows her, discovering that she is directing a play on a small Broadway-style stage titled Edward. As he enters and hears a few lines, he realizes the play is based on his life. Accidentally, Edward catches the eye of the casting team selecting and auditioning the role of Edward, but he doesn't impress Ingrid. Determined to secure the part, he returns the next day wearing his mask. Ingrid is surprised by his new appearance, but Edward, now going by the name Guy, delivers a brilliant performance. Acting alongside the actress playing Ingrid, he impresses the casting team and secures the role in the play. Later, Edward lies to Ingrid, claiming that the character in the play reminds him of a childhood friend who had a similar life but has since passed away. He explains that this memory overwhelmed him during his first audition. Ingrid listens but remains indifferent to his subtle advances. As Edward surveys the theater, he feels like just another face in the crowd. Meanwhile, Ingrid is thrilled to have found someone who can bring her vision to life. Not long after, Ingrid invites Edward to her apartment. There, he notices his old typewriter and the late neighbor's cat, but says nothing about their former owners. She offers him a drink and, after some conversation, invites him to dance. They share a moment and spend the night together. Edward starts rehearsing for the play, delivering an exceptional performance as he essentially voices his own thoughts and experiences. His portrayal is deeply authentic. One day, a man named Oswald, who also has neurofibromatosis, visits the theater and takes an interest in the production. Charismatic and self-assured, Oswald is impressed by Edward's performance and strikes up a conversation with him. That night, Ingrid unexpectedly asks Edward to put on his mask. When he complies, she bursts into laughter, finding the mask so terrible that it becomes amusing. Later, Edward spends an evening at a bar with his real estate colleagues. Out of the blue, Oswald calls out to Guy, calling him a future star and praising his talent, surprising everyone. Oswald's charm quickly wins the group over, and he praises Guy's acting again. At the next rehearsal, Edward criticizes Ingrid's way of portraying the main character. They argue because Ingrid is basing her performance on experiences she hasn't actually had. Oswald shows up again and easily connects with the cast. Edward grows more annoyed with how friendly and social Oswald is. Even Ingrid starts to warm up to him since they share common interests, like their favorite books. Oswald eagerly agrees to stay and watch the rehearsal. Later, the cast heads to a bar, where Edward quietly observes Oswald and Ingrid having an animated conversation about the themes of her play. Oswald questions whether the protagonist would really choose to end his life, arguing that people like him value life too much. Though Edward joins in the laughter, he feels a growing bitterness inside. Meanwhile, Oswald keeps the group entertained with jokes and stories, and even learns how to whistle, further charming everyone. That night, Edward wakes up to find Ingrid rewriting the play. She admits Oswald was right. Her Edward is too dull and gloomy, falling into a predictable story trap. Edward is furious. When he raised the same concerns before, she brushed him off. But now that Oswald said it, she's ready to change everything. They have a heated argument, and the tension carries over to the next rehearsal. Edward loses his temper, and his frustration keeps showing despite his efforts to stay composed. Finally, he storms out in anger. In the park, Edward comes across a cheerful Oswald practicing yoga, surrounded by beautiful women and admiring a living Lincoln statue. Later, they go to a karaoke bar, where a charming woman openly flirts with Oswald. When Oswald takes the microphone, his unique voice mesmerizes the crowd. Edward watches in disbelief as everyone is drawn to Oswald's performance, completely overlooking his appearance. At the next rehearsal, Edward is devastated to learn that Ingrid has given his role to Oswald. She explains that she's completely changed the concept of the play. To make matters worse, she even created a new role for a handsome man, something Oswald insisted on, refusing to perform without it. Edward feels crushed, especially when he realizes how much Ingrid knows about Oswald's personal life. He argues that the transformation of the protagonist by the end of the play will feel unbelievable. Ingrid counters that it doesn't matter because the heroine views the protagonist through the eyes of love. Devastated, Edward is further crushed when Ingrid rejects his request to meet that evening. The play premieres to great success, with Oswald earning rave reviews for his performance. Edward watches as Ingrid grows closer to Oswald, sinking deeper into despair as Oswald gains more recognition, including glowing press features. One day, Ingrid informs Edward that she has to let him go. His mental state worsens, and he begins stalking Oswald. During this, he spots Oswald with a woman and a child. Consumed by jealousy, Edward confronts Ingrid, accusing Oswald of cheating on her. However, she calmly explains that she knows all about Oswald's daughter and his loving relationship with his late wife. She dismisses Edward's accusations. Later, Edward overhears that Oswald is moving into his old apartment. In a fit of rage, Edward smashes the newly repaired ceiling. That night, haunted by everything that has happened, Edward reflects on the events of his life. The next morning, Edward greets prospective buyers while wearing his plaid Edward mask. Later, at the office, his erratic behavior alarms his colleagues, and he is fired. That evening, Edward storms into the theater, creating chaos by attacking Oswald on stage. During their struggle, part of the set collapses, leaving Edward with severe injuries to his arms and legs. During his recovery, Edward moves back into his old apartment, now next door to Ingrid, who lives with Oswald. She is working on a film adaptation of Edward with a renowned director. Edward, however, remains passive, barely reacting to the news. Edward spends his days watching Oswald thrive, playing the saxophone, exercising, and enjoying movie nights with Ingrid, who is now pregnant and glowing with happiness. This contrasts sharply with Edward's own misery, baffling even his physiotherapist. When the therapist makes a disdainful comment about people like Oswald, Edward snaps and stabs him, landing himself in prison. Years later, Edward crosses paths with Oswald and Ingrid again. Her play is still a hit on Broadway, though Oswald has retired. The film adaptation was never made, much to Ingrid's relief. The couple is happy and planning to move to Canada to join an artist community now that their children are grown. As they sit together, a waiter approaches to take their order. Edward hesitates, unable to decide. Oswald steps in, orders for him, and jokes with a smile, "Some things never change, old friend." Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe so as to watch our latest uploads.